Muy buenas noches. Soy Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, Director of Creative Justice Initiative, and welcome. Muy buenas noches. Um, Thank you for being with us. The idea of these conversations is to center Afro-Latinidad. I think that one of the things that we're realizing, or I'm realizing in conversations with many of my friends and my colleagues, is that people are defining who we are as Afro-Latinos. And we're not defining ourselves. We're not talking about ourselves. We're not saying who we are, what we represent, the diversity of cultures we represent, the experiences we represent as Afro-Latinos. And the fact that according to the Washington Post, an article I read, uh, we were here first. Obviously, the Native Americans were here first, of course. But we've never talked about the presence of Afro-Latinos in Florida that were the first to come to what we now call the United States. So that there is a lot that we don't know about ourselves. There's a lot that we're finding out. There's a lot that we have to investigate when this period of censorship is being celebrated by some. So, erasure is not an option. Censorship is not an option. And as we move forward in our understanding of ourselves and our discussing ourselves, it's important that we understand that at the same time we're talking about who we are, what we are, there is pushback. We saw it in the elected officials in California that these United States define us as so-called minorities, which we're not, and that internal discriminatory practice that we have sort of learned, we need to let go because situations amongst ourselves must be a unifying connection. As members of the African diaspora, we connect with other cultural groups that represent the diaspora, and we must together define ourselves as who we are. Absolutamente Negro, the name of the series. So I would like to introduce Janelle Martinez, who's our moderator, and she will be taking us through today. But before I do that, I want to say thank you to Josue, the Afro-Latin Forum, because when I started thinking about this idea and talking to colleagues and friends, um, he was campaigning and set forth a campaign with the Afro-Latin Forum on the censorship, because the censorship also looks to erase us. And if you looked at the New York Times today, you saw that you could be Puerto Rican, you could be Colombian, but you couldn't be Afro-Colombian or you couldn't be Afro-Puerto Rican or Afro-Latin in any way. So that's erasure. So this conversation and the many that are coming after are about centering our experience, centering our presence, and definitely identifying correctly as absolutamente negro. So Janelle, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Marta, for really setting the foundation for tonight's discussion, which serves as the pre-launch to a 10 multi-city convening the practice of Freedom Conversation series, Absolutamente Negro, Negra, Negrex, Negre, or Absolutely Black. So tonight's event, Contextualizing Absolutamente Negro, comes at a pivotal time for Afro-descendants in the Caribbean, Latin America, and the US. On one hand, the movement for Black lives as a continuum, right, of the civil rights, Black power, and Pan-African movements has further solidified Black identity as global. But then on the other hand, despite the very clear ancestral and cultural ties that exist among Afro-descendants, there is still a misconception on what it means to exist as Afro-Latinx, Black Latinx, or Negrex. I know we define ourselves in many different ways, but as Dr. Martha just said, us defining ourselves for ourselves, right? And despite 200 million Afro descendants living in the Americas, Afro-Latinx is accounting for, approximately 6 million people in the US. The refusal to acknowledge us has very real social, economic, political, among other effects. And so to delve even deeper into this, we have a phenomenal, brilliant panel of activists, scholars, and institution and movement builders. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for this evening. I'll start with Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, the founder of the Creative Justice Initiative and also co-founder of Corredor Afro. We have Rafaela Uribe, Associate Counsel at Latino Justice, PRLDEF's Racial Justice Project. We have award-winning organizer and independent journalist Rosa Clemente. And we have Josue Perea, Executive Director of the Afro-Latino Forum. And so before we really get into tonight's conversation, it would not be possible if not for the funders, the collaborators, and the advisory board. So I want to extend a huge thank you and gratitude for all for making this possible. And you will see them currently on the screen. So thank you for the generous support. So I know we are all excited. This is a timely conversation and definitely one that we want to dive into. So I will not hold up this rich conversation any further. But wanting to start with a question for all of the panelists, as we reflect on this sort of decades-long movements, alongside your own work, why this conversation and why now? And anyone can take that, or I can pass the mic to someone specifically. Shall we start with Rosa?
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here, but I'm a little subdued right now because of the situation in Palestine and friends losing baby. It's horrible. But with that said, can you just repeat that again, Janelle?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I also want to acknowledge what you mentioned about the current state of what is happening. But as you mentioned, the question reflecting on the decades-long movements alongside your own work, why this conversation and why now?
So yeah, look, I believe we've been having these kind of conversations for a long time, and I think it's very popular. But for me, what I'm studying is particularly like Afro descendants in hip hop culture in the Bronx, because much of the academic work and most of the academic work is about looking at this in Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, and I'm like, nobody's really my generation of hip hop folks where we found our voices, especially those of us that were African descendants, So, but I do believe like now, I don't believe that someone saying they're Afro-Latino or Black Latino, that's no longer a revolutionary thing because it's being commodified. It's being like most events I go to, it comes down to food, hair, and drummers, but it's not talking about the Black politic, right? And I think that's what we have to be mindful of. If somebody saying they're Afro-Black Latinx, what are their politics? Because they could be Afro-Black everything and still be anti-Black, So I want to see the conversation more framed around, as you said, Janelle, because that's the framing of my first chapter around Pan-Africanism, and Arturo Schomburg, but also Marcus Garvey, his wife Anna Garvey, and that particularly like Du Bois and then Malcolm began to travel the world and realize, oh, there's Black people all over the world, right? But for me specifically, like the equation for me is the same with like making a metaphor. You know, because you say you're Puerto Rican, if you say you're for statehood, then to me, you're not a Boricua, or I'm not going to spend my time, you know, being with you, kind of thing. So I think, and I want the conversation to elevate us more in a Black political radical tradition, and that we can also break the binary of how race is still talked about in this country, where it's Black and white, but not Black, including us, you know?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I want to add something to that, Rosa. I think that was really good. Thank you so much for setting that foundation. And our hearts are grieving with the situation that's happening for Palestinians and in Palestine. I want to mention real quick that I think that is an important moment, because I think, as you mentioned, Rosa, there is a time. I think, as Marta mentioned, as Janelle mentioned, as Rosa mentioned, we are in a juncture in our society where there are more of us being recognized and, like you said, self-recognized or whatever. But then politically, where are we aligning? And it's not about parties, but it's how are we making sure that we are worrying about the daily lived experience of Afro-Latinas, Afro-Latinas, Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latinaos all over the country and all over the world. And the reality is that that's where you start to see where different emphases have been, right? So we need to have this conversation. Like Rosa said, some of us have been having these conversations for a minute. We've been around. There's been a lot of different conversations, different levels of conversation, different areas of conversation, but it's starting to become an issue where, even as much as we're having conversations, the anti-Blackness that's within the Latino, Latina, Latinx community, and the anti-Blackness that is faced overall by all people of African descent in this country and throughout the world, is still something that affects us daily. Like we are the population that has most mental health and other issues because of the result of racism and anti-Black racism. We are more than twice more likely than other people of color to experience discrimination based on race. So there's a lot of really important data points that we have now where we can point that there's still a necessity for us to have this issue and to have this conversation now. I think it starts to prepare us to get to be more politically aligned. Like you said, Rosa, how are we aligning with the Black radical tradition in this country and throughout the world? One of the misconceptions that I think many people have is that there is no Black Latino, or let's call it Black Latinidades or Afro-Latinidades, as sometimes we say at the forum. There is no radical tradition in Latin America. That's not true. There's maroon communities and resistance that has always been around by Black folk in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that have come to the States and done that, right? And so I think that we have to start to claim those spaces. And I think the reason why we need this conversation now is because some of that is being lost by what you said, this commodifying of Afro-Latinidad. Lately, in a conversation that Dr. Marta Moreno and I were at in San Francisco, we said that. We're like, many people will let us do this song and dance show, and that's great. And you can do that every day and twice on Sunday and whatever. People will let you do that as much as you want. But when we start talking about inequity and the fact that healthcare access looks different for Black Latinas, Black Latinos than it looks for someone else, that the stats that we know from different reports that have come out, that Black Latinas are the most educated, but the least likely to own wealth, that starts to show you that there's a racial aspect to these conversations, and that we still need to talk about them in a very serious way to move away from just the visibility or identifying politics that we have, which are important. But our conversations need to move forward, and we need to move the conversations forward to how we're qualifying and quantifying the lived experiences, and how are we repairing the impact of white supremacy that really has impacted our communities for a long time, whether communities here in the States or communities all throughout Latin America. I was born in Colombia, and Afro-Colombians are always still figuring out ways in which they're overcoming these barriers that have been placed by the state, placed by different white pigmentocracies that continue to place Black at the bottom, right? Us people of African descent at the bottom. So I think it's a really important time for us to start to do that and to start to work together to do that, right? It's enough that we've done it individually, but it's time that a lot of us are going to start to work together. And I think we need to start working together to deal with these issues in all of the different realms in which they appear.
I agree absolutely, Josue, because one of the things that we have to recognize is that there have been many movements before us. We can talk about different conferences that have happened in Venezuela, different conferences that happened in Chile on Afro-Latinidad, and also Native American issues, because that's a major part of our population that's never talked about, right? And the African presence, it's not talked about. And the reason it's not talked about is racism, discrimination, erasure. We know that. But what are we going to do about it? When we're talking about censorship of our voices, the elimination of curriculums that deal with us, then what are we saying? How do the numbers then figure in creating action that's going to correct all that you're talking about? And that's where we are now. When somebody talks about censorship, talks about the changing of a curriculum, right? And adding a curriculum that is lies and mythology, right? What are we saying if we don't react to that in ways that creates another curriculum, which is the work that the forum has been engaged in, that we have been engaged in creating creative justice, in creating El Corredor Afro in Puerto Rico, documenting a history of fact, not a mythology, right? And when we did a series where we said that the law is not the law, right? We're also seeing that the law that is being enacted is against the law that we understood was the law, right? And that's critical. Who is being impacted by the lack of abortion rights? I'm the grandmother of two daughters, of two granddaughters. Do I promise them less than what I had the opportunity to have? Who is being most effective if it's not our own, if it's not our children? So we need to address that.
Yes, to kind of to build on what all of these amazing panelists have mentioned, when we're talking about the legal landscape that we're living under right now, the previous Supreme Court term, we saw a retrenchment and a lashing out against the gains that we've made the past 50 years when it comes to affirmative action, when it comes to abortion access, even student loans, voting rights, and even the ongoing colonization of Puerto Rico. In all of these realms, Black folks, Black Latinos are disproportionately affected. When we look at studies about who is carrying the most student debt, Black women across ethnic identities, Black American Latinos are carrying that debt. It is a racial issue when when the Supreme Court of our country is saying we do not recognize relief or the rights of people to have access to these services, to have access to these human rights. It is a racialized issue. And as Black Latinos, as Afro-Latinos, it is a pivotal moment for us because the numbers are growing, as everyone has mentioned, and also our selfhood, our ability to have our families and to thrive with dignity is being challenged as well. And so it's a pivotal moment for all of us to think about what like Rosa mentioned, what is the politic that goes with a Black Latino identity.
Absolutely. And, you know, as each of you mentioned, the impact, right? Who is most affected? And it is Afro-Latinxes. And so we're going to address a lot of what each of you have spoken to in individual questions. So I do want to transition to that and begin speaking about, or start rather, with talking about institutions. And so specifically, this question is for you, Dr. Marta. With Black cultural workers across the diaspora, having built institutions that fall within traditional standards of an institution, but also have redefined how these spaces, and when I say space, not just physical, but also digital spaces exist. Given your journey professionally in pioneering and building culturally grounded institutions, what are the challenges faced, and how do we proceed with upkeeping these vital spaces, not only now, but also as we move toward the future?
Well, we have to think of the different type of spaces, right?
Mhm.
We have to see home as a space, right? We have to see home as that place that we begin the training of our young, that we begin to share information with our young. As a public school teacher, which is how I started my career in the public school system of New York, I realized that what I was teaching my students was wanting because it didn't reflect them in any way. In the Lower East Side, in Loisaida, the material that I was sharing with my students had nothing to do with them. So it was a responsibility to create a curriculum outside of the curriculum, right? In my classroom, I had to create material to make sure that my students, my junior high school students, saw themselves reflected in what they were reading and what they were hearing, right? And it wasn't easy because what I had to do was tell the students, if you see somebody at the door, let me know and we'll go back to the curriculum that we're supposed to have. And they understood what was happening. They absolutely understood it. So as I developed, I was very clear that we have to build our own institutions. We have to incorporate our institutions. We have to have spaces, safe spaces, not only that we can think, that we can do the research, that we can support our scholars, that we can celebrate the work that's being done, because the support for that is wanting. Because the art system, the cultural system that exists is also racist and discriminatory. So that if the cultural manifestations being celebrated do not look white or do not look Eurocentric or it's some aesthetic that is fabricated, right? Our support for our institutions are limited, extremely limited. So the people doing this work, right, and the people I spoke to in putting together this series of conversations and other programs that we have done are people who are committed to our communities, are committed to our people, because they're doing it for the most part without salaries. They're doing it because they understand the discriminatory practices that are being instituted and taught to our children so that our children don't see themselves when they look into the mirror, right? They don't see their reflection because they don't read about their reflection. And that becomes critical in a period where we see censorship, right? Overtly being promoted, where we see that curriculum to erase our existence, our presence, is being promoted. And not only promoted in one state, but going across the country. So that we have to make the decision, right, as to whether we allow ourselves to be erased or is our presence going to be honored and we're going to honor it, right? And we can't vacillate on it. No podemos, be shy about it. And that's why we named the series Absolutely Black, because we have to be clear as to who we are and where we're going. So I hope that answers your question.
It absolutely does. And I also think among the many, points that you made, the fact that we define the space, right? So there is the institution and, in quote unquote, the traditional, and even that can be questioned, right? But we are defining it. We are risking and implementing curriculum and other, strategies to where we are informing our community, starting with the young, about themselves to be reflected and also to archive ourselves. So
we've always done that. And we have maroons throughout the globe that have continued to do it and insist upon doing it, because understanding the consequences of not doing it is erasure.
I would also say, like, we don't have a movement in this country. you know, we're going to have to grapple with the reality of what has happened with major organizations, from Black Lives Matter to Color Change to Ibram Kendi in Boston. Because that's where I feel like my generation we're not doing that. Like, people are scared to say that didn't work. What happened? All these kind of things. And we've seen the right-wing media take and basically break these organizations. And until we can analyze how it went down, I have young people telling me they will never trust an institution ever. And it breaks my heart, you know, because what was established, and particularly what Dr. Vega did, right? An institution, brick and mortar institution. We might have 3 of those, maybe 4 in the whole country. But the consistency of the Caribbean Cultural Center to not only speak for us, be for us, to then mentor us and teach us. And that's what I kind of now want to do more. I want to write and mentor. And when I'm talking to a lot of the young kids, they're like, we don't ever want to be part of anything because these organizations messed up. I'm not saying we have to have the discussion on CNN, but we have to have the discussion. What happened? How did this happen? How did we allow it to happen? So I think that's the reason. I know for a fact the reason overall is we don't have a unified movement. I don't mean everybody doing the same thing. I mean operational unity. Operational unity, meaning I might not like that person, my idea might be different, but we need to come together and figure that out. We don't even have that at this point. And that's why books are being banned. Everything that's going on with LGBTQIA, which is majority, you know, women and binary folks of color. The attack on, look, in Florida and Texas, right? Florida and Texas have a law that if a speaker is going to go to a public space, you know, all the Texas schools, all in public space, you now have to sign the contract to say you won't use certain words, right? And how does that reflect what's happened these last 2 days around Palestine? And how is it together? The media has a list of words they're not going to use, that the United States government is like, don't use that. You're a media person, like you're supposed to be interviewing people. But if we just look at the way they have dehumanized Palestinians, they have threatened violence is violence. You know, I think can there be a moment where we can come together? I think so. But as Martha was saying, like, now we have to deal with, she can't come, she can't speak there, sign this contract. You know,
Mhm.
I think that's very hard on young people who need institutions and not TikTok. You know what I'm saying? But I think until we're able to grapple with what were the great things and what were the bad things, where do we go? I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't think we're at that point yet.
Absolutely. And I do think, though, having these real conversations, you know, creating those spaces to where some of that can be, you know, addressed is really important. And even in the quote unquote non-traditional spaces, I do feel that the digital realm, though it has its limitations, definitely has the space for beyond borders, that connection, those conversations. And wanting to get back to censorship a bit further, and also Rosa, will be getting to you to speak to more of the media angle. But this next one is for Josue. While there have always been attempts to erase Black history and the contributions of Afro descendants from classrooms and really overall the education system, as we've been speaking to, the curriculum restrictions and book bans have reached a new level of censorship. You know, The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, All Boys Are Blue by George M. Johnson, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison are among the many books that are currently banned in the US. You spearheaded Afro-Latinx curriculum development. How can we ensure that our racial, ethnic, and, you know, cultural footprint is not erased amid the state and national laws, and as we're noting, the current book ban movement?
Yeah, thank you. I want to add something to the prior thing, and then I'll answer just because I think it's important. I want to quote Dr. Loretta Ross. Dr. Loretta Ross is one of the OGs in the reproductive justice movement, founder of the Sister Song and other organizations. So she said something in a conversation that was really good. She said, why we became complacent when we started trusting that these spaces had our best interest, right? She was really talking about reproductive justice, and really that there were some people that thought that, oh yeah, the Supreme Court is never going to overturn Roe v. Wade and everyone's going to be fine. And the reality, she said, she was like, I never had confidence in those things to support mine, because historically in this country, they have never supported Black women. And why would I expect that they would change to support Black women at that point in time? And the reason why I say that, to connect to what Dr. Marta was saying and what Rosa was saying, is that there is a complacency that I think happened, right? But foundational support for Afro-Latino organizations is still the lowest amongst all Latino subgroups. Latino organizations, I think we say, is like 2%, 1% of all foundation funding. Afro-Latinos, the number of organizations is actually just like 5 or 7. It's no more than 7 that have ever received organizational foundational funding. So I think there's a part where we became complacent on some stuff like, oh, we'll be fine, we're going to be good, we're going to be able to fundraise. And some of the radical aspects of what we were doing, we were too confident on someone else to give it to us. And this is why we still have to fight for it now. Like, there's not that many brick and mortar orgs. I do credit a lot of young people, the number of young women, Afro-Latinas like yourself, Janelle, like Rosa, like many other people who are doing this work, created digital institutions online, then they could not be controlled by someone who was like, I'm choosing to pull my funding, or I'm not going to give you funding if you do that. And the reason why that matters is because I do think that we need to not be so dependent and so like, oh, we're gonna, think that that this institution, this state, whatever, is going to support us, when it has never supported the efforts, anti-Black efforts, anti-racist efforts. Exactly. How that connects to book bans and all these different conversations is that, again, as many of you know, I'm a student of Miriam Jimenez Roman, and I'm a student also of James Baldwin, and I'm a student of all these people that had always been banned because people had always not wanted to hear the truth, right? People don't know, Miriam was on one time officially on one of those lists by the FBI or CIA. She was on one of those lists of like someone who people shouldn't work with. James Baldwin's books, as you know, his own publisher wouldn't publish some of his books because they were like, oh, you're talking to real stuff, and we're not going to do that. I say that just to say this, that I think it's really important that we, as Black people, as people of African descent, as progressive people, all of those who are connecting here who may not be, who may not self-recognize or be Black, it's our responsibility to then pass that education in our own ways, through our own, the way that the African people of African descent have always done, which has been through oral tradition and through subversive and revolutionary movements. The way that, Rosa is in the background because she's an associate producer of Judas and the Black Messiah. The way that some of those folks were moving was not, waiting for some institution to validate what they were saying. They were like, we're going to go ahead and validate that on our own. And I think that's the really revolutionary aspect that some of us have done, is really just been like, bet, you're not going to say it, I'm going to say it. And I'm going to just go ahead and I'm not going to ask you for permission. I'm just going to start to connect works and to connect books and to have conversations. This is why part of the work that we do at the forum is always to like have book conversations. Let's have this writer, let's have this author, let's feature that. Because if your state's going to ban that, we're not going to ban that. And it's important for curriculum creation, because I think what has been said already many times is that it's really up on the next generations, right? Like we have to make sure that they have the tools, that they have the knowledge, that they have the historical awareness of these fights that have happened and how we move forward, and what is the next step for that. What does that look like for us? Why is that important? Because the more that you see these bans come and these things be enacted, the more that the people who suffer at that are the young people. We here, this panel, we be fine. We've read a lot of things. We're well read. We're well quoted. We can quote all these people night and day. So we're going to have to pass on this knowledge to people who are going to have harder time to do that. And the more spaces that we have that are independently created and funded and independently supported and maybe community supported, right, by us, by this community, by our communities, are able to pass on that knowledge, that's going to help, because then we're no longer dependent on the Department of Education, or we're no longer dependent on a specific state or a philanthropist system that doesn't always support Black Latinos or Black Latinas in the country. And so I think number one, I think that's a really important that we ensure it. And I think that what we have to do is place ourselves in a lot of places where these people for the bookman movement are. They be going to parent teacher groups and signing up for positions and winning elections here, even here in New York City. And that's why I think that some of us have been a little bit complacent, where we're like, oh, I don't need to go to that meeting. We now our people got a lot to do. Some of our people holding multiple jobs, holding multiple, like the real lived experience for some of our people. It's not that we have the privilege to do that. So then that's where organizing comes into play. We have to organize and be like, all right, these parents are going to be at that, try to elect the new superintendent. We're going to be at that. And we're going to make our voice heard. And we're going to be the ones who say why this matters and why this counts. Because if you look at the way that movement's moving, just like any other of the movements, like the anti-abortion movement or whatever movements, they're strategic. They're putting people in certain positions. So we have to put people in certain positions, right? Black Latinas, for example, out of all the Latinas in this country, Black Latinas are 35% of the Latinas that are affected by abortion bans. That's a large percentage. Black Latinas and indigenous Latinas make the majority of that. So that means that we need to band together in those states where that's happening. Similarly, in our school systems, most of our kids are the ones that are suffering, especially down in Florida and in the other states. It's a lot of Black Latino children that are suffering at the hand of these bookmans. So we have to organize and start to really build, like Rosa was saying, build a movement that is politically organized, and that we're like, great, we're going to put people here, because we need to win these seats, because those seats will control the curriculum for our kids, because that's the way that some of those movements are moving. So I think we have to pass on those traditions on our own and build our own spaces and pass on our knowledge and share the history of Puerto Ricans in this country, of Panamanians in this country, of Dominicans in this country, of Colombians in this country, of all of that, in Afro, and of course focusing on Blackness there. We center Blackness when we talk about Latinidad or Latinidades, like many different ways, but also we have to organize. And we have to organize and be in those places, because if we don't organize, then it's wishful thinking. And we could say this all day, but then we're going to always be having these battles, losing more space each and every moment.
Absolutely. I also, like each of you are mentioning, right? Like, again, echoing like Dr. Martha said, and Josue, you saying about creating these spaces, as Rosa and also you have just said, right? Like, it's about essentially organizing, right? And being strategic and being on the ground. And so with that, I'm going to transition to Rosa. And I want to ask you a bit about the formation of the narrative, specifically media. We know that the dominant narrative in media around Black Latinx identity is that we do not exist. As an independent journalist, media maker, the founder of the Black Latinx Media Collective, your work counters that and pushes against the invisibility of Afro-Latinxes in media, both as media creators and producers, but those of us that are also consuming the media. How can traditional and new media be used to further affirm negros, negrexes, negras? Oh, Rosa, you're on mute.
I haven't done that, so excuse me. But for me, my trajectory is like very different than other folks. I wasn't born into a movement, and I knew I was Puerto Rican, but then I went to college, and I tell people all the time, because I write, I was beginning to join groups, and I saw Martha speak, and I ran up to her because I had never even heard the term African descendant. All I remember is when she finished, only like 10 of us stood up, and it was like a room of 300 people. So I was like, all right. So I ran up on her, and she became my mentor, and that's how I connected to my comrades, Mari Nieves and Lumumba Mandela. But, my journalism, quote, journalism, because I didn't go to school for that, is when I wrote an article called Who is Black? And it's amazing to me, like 22 years after reading that, people still like, oh my God. And it's been translated to some other languages, and to this day, people are like, oh, and I was like, damn, are we still here? Like, that was 22 years ago and we're still here. So, for me, coming into journalism, starting radio with I started in radio on WBAI. That's how I got to know Ilombe Brath, who's incredible. I mean, he's no longer with us. And it was me being in college that Cornell University, Dr. Turner recruited me. And he's like, listen, you're not going to come here to get a Cornell degree. You're going to come here to use your scholarship for our people. Are you ready? I was like, absolutely. So the article, and then subsequently I wrote one about 4 years ago where I tell the story of my stuff, but I also critique the fact that I was seeing this like 4 years ago, always a conversation about race. I mean, hair, food, and a drum, you know. And what I said in that article, and I think it hit with folks, was like, is us being Latino, Latina a political identifier? Absolutely not. Not for me. And I don't even call myself Afro, Black, Latina. Like other people do, that's cool. But I'm a Black Puerto Rican. And that's how I always come to the table. And I tell people I'm not Black and Puerto Rican. But my independent journalism also gave me the ability to, you know, be in spaces that were united around something, even though the ethnic or racial people that we are is different. You know, so I get lucky. I don't have to write for a living. And I think the most pushback I got, Janelle, was the piece I did about the museum, the National Hispanic Museum. And I was like, there's 30 people, then they are legit all white, maybe two. And I knew it was a powerful, what I wrote was powerful, because then the people running the board went to Latino Rebels and was like, she's lying about all of this. And they were like, no, like Latino Rebels is a space for us to write. And I was like, see, even that got them so amped already, because I'm just telling you what you see when you go to your website. So for me, I will always be able to do the independent journalism. And then lastly, with Puerto Rico on the map, you know, after Hurricane Maria, you know, I was lucky. I said, let me see if we can raise some money. We did that. I purposely picked younger people. And I think that's because also Martha always instilled in me and brought me into spaces that maybe I would have never been in. You know, and I said, I want to take a young crew, and I did, you know, and the work we did was phenomenal. And then we were able to do the little documentary on particularly Black Puerto Ricans of Luisa, you know. So I can't even tell you how many people to this day were like, what y'all did was great. And they'll say you. I said, no, us together is great. And that was also lastly the moment for me where I was like, I need to write more, but I'm really in a space where I want to mentor young people. And everybody asked, who gave you the money for PR on the map? Did it exist? I said, it didn't exist. We created, and the people gave us the money, period. And we went and did the work. And yeah, so, and, you know, when I got something to say, I say it. I don't write all the time like that. But when I do, I know, because I'm always trying to figure out why I'm trying to figure out why we are not politically engaged. And I don't mean about electoral politics. I'm not talking about that. I'm again talking the politics of Blackness, you know. And I recently read this quote from Stephen Biko, who was helped create the movement to end apartheid in South Africa, but also his comrade was Nelson Mandela. And he says, by calling yourself Black, you have already begun the process to be a revolutionary. You know?
Mm-hmm. And that's powerful. And I will say this in speaking to your work, and really all of the work that each person here is doing, it's that's still a form of mentorship. Even like when I saw your writing and your work, for me, that just emboldened me to continue doing this work, right? And so I think speaking up and speaking out, and just existing is really revolutionary in itself. And so thank you for that. I am going to transition a bit to speak about racial justice and Rafaela, this one is for you. Anti-Black racism has erased asylum seekers, immigrants, and migrants from Central American countries like Honduras, where my family's from, Guatemala, Haiti, the continent of Africa, and many other countries. Approximately 1 in 10 Black people, or approximately 4.5 million people in the US are immigrants, according to the Pew Research Center. They are navigating displacement, forced migration, violence, racism. So with that, what does support look like from an immigrant justice lens, given all of those things at play?
Right. So from an immigrant justice lens, I think that what you mentioned, the erasure is really one of the problems that we have to first fundamentally address. When we're seeing news reports about migration issues, they're not looking at Black folks and like what Black folks are experiencing. And like you said, we're seeing a changing demographic in who is coming to the United States. Like you mentioned, folks from Central America and South America who are Black. And we know from studies and from the work that organizations do, like Black Alliance for Just Immigration or the Haitian Bridge Alliance, that when you go to the border, when you go into detention centers, it is Black folks and Indigenous folks who are facing the harshest detention conditions, the harshest detention penalties, who are not even being granted the opportunity for asylum or to apply for refugee status. And so when we're talking about immigrant justice, we are talking about racial justice. And we need to intertwine our understanding that immigration issues are about challenging the racial dynamics that exist in our country, and in order to be able to actually make changes to the immigration system, we really need to challenge the anti-Blackness that allows for those abuses of Black folks to happen, not just in immigration detention, but in cages all over this country. And when we're talking about prisons, we're talking about police, it's all very connected and it's all intersectional, and we need to address that in a holistic way.
Can I just say this too? I'm so glad you mentioned it. So like 10 days ago, I was coming back home, and the last 2 times I flew out, I was going through Atlanta. And every time I've gone through Atlanta, I would see young kids, right? They all had the same sweatshirt on, the same, everything in a plastic bag. And I was like, oh, these are undocumented young people. And they were racially Black, you know? So then I was like, what's going on? So I started checking here in Albany, like, right. So then I get off the flight and get another flight. And I said to them, I said, are you okay? And immediately the white man was like, you don't need to talk to them. I was like, well, actually, now I'm going to talk to them. And, you know, they wouldn't really respond. And I was just like, so it's 1:30 in the morning. They've been on a plane all the way in the back. And they're just with like 2 weird adults. So I started doing like a chat with this police officer, and he's like, yeah, I don't understand it either. It's just that we're not allowed to say anything. So anyway, I go up to them one more time and I say, I'm sorry, the journey has been hard. And I'm talking to them in Spanish. And, you know, you are loved. You are welcome here. I live here. Aquí, está bien. And then the woman goes, because of her, points to me, because of her, and you listen to her, you're not going to eat today. I said, what? So then I lost it. First, it's 1:30 a.m. Why are they and who's with them? Where are they going? You know, and I lost it. I was like, don't do that. You know, so I was just like, oh my God. And what popped in my mind is the attack on undocumented people. It would be very different if this was white Argentinians or white Hispanic people, right? And as those demographics change, and we, through BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, are also saying, look, there's Haitians, there's Venezuelans, like it's not the same population. So, and then I got home and I felt bad. I was like, maybe I shouldn't have said something. Oh my God. And my husband was like, that's what you do. Now he's like, one of them is going to know you spoke to them and someone cared. Intervening, that's a good way. You know, that's a thing that we can do as well. when we see that.
Yeah, and I think when we're like what you mentioned, Rosa, when we're talking about these issues, like what recently when the New York Times had an expose about migrant children being exploited and working in factories all over the country and children not being enrolled in schools, the children that are being exploited are Black and Indigenous children, right? And so these are issues that affect all of us. And as everyone has mentioned, this is the time for it's people power that changes the conditions that we live under, right? And as lawyers, we can only do so much in terms of using the law as a tool. But it is up to us to become politically engaged, not in electoral politics as mentioned, but in the politics of care, the politics of the Black radical tradition, and how do we show up for each other.
And can I just add real quick? I want to shout out, just real quick, because I want to shout out another org that does a lot of really good work called Undocu Black, which has some Afro-Latino folks led on it. Like there's some Afro-Latino leaders on that org that are formerly undocumented, quote unquote undocumented, or as we sometimes say in the immigration movement, otherly documented or not American documented, not US documented folks that really do that work, because they do know your rights trainings, they do all this work. And this is why, to go to the issue that Marta mentioned earlier about the census and censorship, this is why it's important that we get counted correctly and that we're seen correctly, because we don't know sometimes the numbers of how many of our people are suffering, like what you're saying, Rosa and Rafaela, because they don't get counted correctly when we're being counted. So that's why the work that we did at the Latinos Not a Race campaign and building up this, what we're trying to build as a Afro-Latino coalition, right, of different organizations that are working on that, is because the way, if we don't get counted in certain spaces, then we become invisibilized, to go what Dr. Marta was saying at the jump, right? Like we become invisibilized. So then what happens? People don't know that there are Latinos of African descent. Let's use Latino as a broader term, even though we know there's all issues with that list. Latinos of African descent are the ones that are being detained at the border at higher rates than other Latinos. Indigenous Latinos are being detained at higher rates than other Latinos. And then they're the ones who are experiencing longer time in the immigrant and all that than other folks. And so if we don't quantify that data, then we don't have that. That's why a lot of books are important, right? The books that Dr. Marta Moreno has written, and many others, the Afro-Latino Reader and all these books. But like last year's book that was really important was Racial Innocence, right? This idea of how Latinos don't like to talk about anti-Blackness, because sometimes there's this whole thing about that. But we need to trace that. So what the work that Dr. Tania did, the work that you're doing, Rosa, the work that Janelle did, the work that Rafaela's doing every day, the work that Dr. Marta has been doing for a minute, like we need to highlight those works. Why? Because we always need to talk about the fact that Latinos are not being counted correctly, that then we're not being counted on racial experiences. But whenever we are counted on those experiences, the numbers are disproportionate. I mentioned briefly that I had a conversation with someone at the USDA, and they were looking at numbers of Latino food numbers, right? Like, food poverty and food injustice and who suffers that environmental justice. And I said, great, what are the Black Latino numbers? And they were like, oh, we're not counting like that. And I'm like, I'm sure that if you were to segment those numbers by race within the Latino category, the Black Latino numbers, as we've seen within many other reports, are always worse, because racialization and anti-Blackness plays such a huge role. So I saw Dr. Marta wanted to get a word, but I just wanted to say that real quickly, that I think that's important, because not having our population counted correctly in many different spaces is really detrimental to who we are. And that's the process of invisibilizing. Let's remove it, right? I've learned through the work that we've been doing, especially connecting to the UN and other work, that word is called sometimes statistical genocide, right? We're going to remove a population that then we don't know. And then no one knows this population appeared. And then when they count us, then all of a sudden there's a bunch of us. And it's like, yeah, because that's a project of the state and all that. So I know, Dr. Marta, I know you were going to get a word in there. I just want to say some of those things.
The point I wanted to make is that we need to create the terminology that expresses the reality of our condition, right? And that's why we started these conversations, because we started seeing people referring to us Latina, Latina, Latino, Latin only, And I think that one of the things that we have to define is immigrants. Why do we keep using that? People are either political atrocities happening in their countries, right? And they're coming here. because this land, right, freedom is promised, democracy is promised, right? And certain terms, right, and the way we use certain terms almost minimizes why people come. Not almost, it does minimize why people come. People come for, and not because they're having a good time at home. They're often coming because the United States has destabilized their countries. And we know that, and we don't say it. So that the question becomes our voting rights, right? And I go back to Rafaela, because one of the issues and that is critical to how we move forward, do we have voting rights when those rights are being torn apart? How do we ensure that? Right? One of the commitments we made, Josue, and you were the one that brought it up. Let's have voting opportunities at each site that we're having these conversations. No one is saying vote this way or vote the other way, but do vote. Right? So, how do we talk about ourselves? And the narrative that we use, the terminology that we use, influences the action one takes. Right? And I think that that's a project that we have to engage in, because how we call ourselves, how we see ourselves. I mean, like when I'm teaching, I tell my students, if you use the word minority, you fail the class. If you refer yourself as minority, you fail the class.
But that's the thing is, people, most students don't know that.
How to see themselves.
Yeah, but I'm saying most students don't know that, Martha. Like, I was using the word minority to the early 2000s. It's like, we don't know this stuff. We didn't know it when I was growing up, and we don't know it now. I mean, how many times have we gone, probably all of us, and be like, listen, we're not minorities, you know, and but until young people are even exposed to that, because I think what you're talking about too is, who named us? Who said we're all Latinx all of a sudden? I understand why the X is there. It's to break the binary of gender, right? I get it. But who picked that term? There's no land called Latinx. There's no land called this, you know, and I'm frustrated with the language, because those who name us, if we don't name ourselves, the system comes harder. We get confused.
We have enough people that can right now the forum came up with a curriculum, right? We took the decision, or the forum took the decision to do it. At what point do we say we take the decision to make certain decisions, right? It's redundant, but that's what we have to decide. When do we do that?
But we're doing it. That's my whole thing. Like, young people right now are so confused. Young people right now, and they don't have these conversations. They're worried about the impending climate catastrophe. The younger people don't even, like, for them, they're like, I'm just a human. I don't want anybody naming me, saying, and I'm like, good. I think where we can intervene, though, is on anti-Black. And I push back on that. Because what has happened for us is that all of a sudden the system and Latinos, other ones, are now saying we're anti-Black. Everything in the world is anti-Black. But I think when we, you know, when we're saying it, we know why we're saying it. But the way it's been commodified, and the way it's like already
pro-Black. I would say being anti-Black is not, for me, sufficient. It's
no, I was saying what Jose was saying about anti-Blackness, that we have to work on that. But the conversation the last 3 years has been how we, as Latinx folks, are anti-Black. Like, we're the number one people, we're the minority. Like, the conversations are crazy. And we try to intervene, but what I'm saying is, I think then that takes the onus off white supremacy, and the first code of white supremacy is divide and conquer. Who does it serve when everything we've done, even collectively here, somebody's going to be like, one of y'all is anti-Black? Who does that serve? That's all I'm saying about it, because I know it's been pushed on us, Black, Latinx, Latina. We're getting the heat. I mean, we're at points like I've seen I also see now on Instagram, younger, like Afro Black, proud, like found, I know who I am. And now they begin to interject colorism to the point where I told Martha this story. Somebody read an article, but it wasn't my name in it, but it was about me. And in this article, because I ain't stupid, and everybody's like, I think this is writing about you. I'm like, absolutely. You know, I text them and she goes, you're mad light skinned. You're taking space from dark Black Latinas. How many conferences I've been to that now have a set where they're like, non-Black people of color, go over here. And I've gone over there and they're like, no, you don't count. That's the kind of stuff we be dealing with. So now I'm not, and other people that have my coloring, we're now anti-Black, and because we're not darker, like that colorism it's Yaba Blay already wrote the definitive book on that, but the idea that these younger people who are finding themselves are then saying to some of us, you're too light, you don't count. You're taking away from dark skinned Latinas.
Yeah, I think this is there's a lot of layers to this part. I think that for one, us defining ourselves this is why it's so important. I think even when we talk about anti-Black racism, right? Like anti-Blackness is a constant thing that even as Black folks, we have to constantly push against internally, right? And so that is just a way of the world, because the project of anti-Blackness is so powerful. I also think in terms of the narrative, right, about, you know, Latinx is...
I think, Janelle, is a question. What does pro-Blackness look like?
Right. And I think it's definitely a important question and something for folks to reflect on. But yeah, you know, pro-Blackness is really when people I feel like are affirming their Blackness and saying definitively that they are Black, that is a part of it. But I also think there is space, and this might be veering the conversation elsewhere, for those within our community that are unambiguously Black, that are affected by many of the issues that we discussed today, but may not use the same terminology, right? And I think that there still has to be space for those within this. But I know that is going...
No, but can I add something real quickly, Janelle? Because I think that this is all true. I think partly of what part of this conversation is that there are some needed conversations that we need to have as a community, like we do, because there are times that, Rosa, you're saying you're getting on something that's really important. There have been times in which our movement, our things have been co-opted by, let's call it the mestizaje project or white supremacist projects and white supremacist ideas, to then be like, oh, you see, you don't know about that, so let me further divide you, right? Which has been a long strategy of different projects of racialization. That's why I was going to shout out La UP in Puerto Rico, that calls it's not the race project, they call it the racialization project, right? The idea that that it forces race and racism on folks, and then forces us to then answer to this black-white binary, and then now we have to operate in this black-white binary when it's much deeper than that. The pigmentocracy of race and the way that Latinos have been categorized racially in the history of Latin America, and then how that gets translated to the country. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there. So I always shout that out, because that's why we have to use the term minoritized, racialized, like different ways in which those populations have been forced to deal. And then we need to answer to what the UN said at the last Second and Permanent Forum for the People of African Descent. They were like, we need to continue to track certain things by data and by experience, because or else then it just becomes all words, right? People are like, well, I'm not this, like, or this or that or whatever. But if we can track that by data, then that changes the situation, right? Because now you can't argue. You can make data say whatever you want, but then now you have to actually answer those issues. So I think that there are conversations that we need to have about the way that, how does the pigmentocracy show up? Why are there still ideologies of mestizaje displayed within our people of African descent? Why are there still all these different dynamics that sometimes play out in the way that we talk about other Latino populations? Like sometimes people talk a lot, even Black Latinos talk about other Black Latinos in different ways. I'm going to use the Latino term very broadly. And sometimes I point out, I'm like, yeah, Dominicans are the second likely in this country to check that they're Black more than some other populations. And people are like, oh, I didn't know that. I'm like, yeah. So there's these narratives that we continue that don't help, and that then limit us to that. So what we need to do, and that's why I think this is important, is creating our own terminology, creating our institutions, like what you're doing, Rosa, creating our own media where we're sharing messages that we want to share under our own definition, having our own lawyers that are able to define that. And then lastly, I think a piece of all that connects all of that is organizing. How are we organizing in different spaces, in different places, and not allowing ourselves to be organized? We're organizing ourselves to go to the Black revolutionary ethic of the Young Lords, of the Black Panthers, of all the different people that were organizing themselves. So we're like, the city is not going to do it, so we're going to do it. We're going to do it under this ethic. And I do think it's a time for us to have some conversations around some of these things. But I think that's exactly why we're having this conversation, right? Because we need to have further conversations to really advance this agenda so that we start to align on that. Because young people, I would say that in digital space, and I'm trying to taking too long, but real quickly, in digital spaces, there are some young people that do that. And then there's some positive young folks that are doing work. Like what Janelle does, what Dash Harris does, what hashtag I'm Not Enough does. There's spaces that do that create these spaces that then force really good conversations. And there are spaces that do that. I think sometimes we have to uplift those spaces even more because we have to know that that's where we're going. So sorry for taking long, Janelle. Sorry.
No, absolutely. And I think what also, like in that closing point, right, the work is all built upon each other, right? So the movements of before is informing the digital conversations and the digital spaces that we're seeing. It's a continuum, as I know Dr. Martha often notes. And so I want to kind of head in that direction as we are talking about mobilizing and, you know, what is next before we get into a few questions from the audience. Is really this one being for everyone, and we can kind of answer it not quickly, but you know, kind of touch on those key points. But I like us to really think about the future and what is, again, possible through mobilization and coalition building. What are each of you most hopeful for as we look toward the future?
I'll start, and then since I spoke a lot, and then I won't speak a lot for a while so that we can sense it. But I'll start real quick. I think that, you know, I'm really hopeful for more unity that I'm seeing. I think this conversation is a part of that. I think the Latinos Not a Race campaign was a part of that. I think the work that a lot of us want to do in building a national Afro-Latino coalition that's talking about advocacy issues and policy issues that affect Afro-Latinos is really important. That's all very new, but it's happening, right? We're seeing more collaboration, more engagement. I also see a transgenerational collaboration, right? Where we're collaborating across generations, because we're starting to notice that some of those things that were talked about in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s are still being issues that we have to talk about now. So I'm seeing more cross-generational collaboration, and then I'm seeing it in many different spaces. There were times that we were not in certain spaces, but I'm seeing those conversations, you know, popping up in, for example, in theological spaces, right, in religious spaces, that for a while that wasn't being discussed because there was this deep anti-Blackness within some of those spaces. I'm seeing it there. I'm seeing it, you know, moving only, you know, not being controlled by academia and being controlled by grassroots organizing. I'm seeing it in folks like Undocu Black and Baji, right, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and diversifying the way that we understand Blackness and Latinidad, and making sure that we're including folks who are Black and Latino, Black Latinos, Black Latinas. So I'm seeing it in a lot of different spaces. And I think that we are at a time where we have to coalesce and organize in a way that we're moving with one speed, that we're no longer like, I got a little beef with X person, I got a little problem with X person, so I'm not going to work on that. We got to work together, because the issues that we have to deal with are much bigger than our individual little groups or little whatever. There are bigger issues that we have to deal with. And I think that more that we work together, which I'm seeing more now, I just feel like I'm seeing more of that now. I think that's what gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah, I'm seeing people wanting to come together, right? Because this series started as an idea and conversations with the advisory board list that you'll see at the end of the discussion. And an idea just continues to evolve, right? Because one of the things that is very clear to me in our putting together this series, and I want to say thank you to Sandra Garcia, to Ashley Queen, to Josue, who has collaborated with us. When we're talking to people about the series and the need to talk about it, everybody's saying yes, right? Because one of the things that is clear is that in different part of the countries that we come from and now are here, right? We bring that whatever we learn, we bring with us, so that wherever we settle, some of the thinking is different, some of the framework is different, even if we're of African descent or native descent, and we don't know each other because we're generally isolated in the pockets that we sort of grow up in, right? I'm Barrio New York, growing up, right? But in putting together the kinds of projects that are international and global and not, and weave people together, I'm realizing that how I grew up is not necessarily how you grew up, right? Uh, how California, Afro-Latinos think in California and are facing certain things. In the Bronx, we're facing different things, although they may be the same, right? Because racism, we know, is at the bottom of it, most of it. But now we're beginning to learn more from each other, as opposed to seeing our reality as the national reality or as the global reality. We all bring information. And what we need to do now is thread that information in ways that assist us in the growth that we have to make. And that is part of the language we use and how we refer to ourselves, how we label ourselves, because we have the ability to do that. We don't have to worry. I don't worry about tal y tal me llamo esto. I call me who I call me. And that I write in my books, and that I do in whatever I do. You have to claim who you are. And that's why in talking, we tested to see how people felt about absolutamente negro, right? And no one said no, right? And the series that is a national series, including Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States still, right? Everybody said yes. So to me, that's tremendous for the future, that we can say yes to that collectively.
For me, until we have media, this won't continue. We don't even have a podcast on our issues, not like one, right? We're not being represented in any level on the media. And that's why I did start Black Latinx Media Collective, because I know what, like, I see a lot of the TikTok videos and I see a lot of younger Black Latina women like bringing the heat, right? And I'm like, it's a generational divide. What we see as media is not what our elders see in media. To them, media is MSNBC, CNN, hopefully not Fox News, whatever, New York Post, right? Papers. But younger people are like on TikTok and doing other things. That's creative and good. But we, to this day, we do not have anything. Like, we don't have a day. Like, let's do a week. Hispanic Heritage Month is there. Let's not even look at that month. Let's us create a day of the Afro-Latino in America, or a week, like something, because I know going to college, those days were affirming who I am once I knew who I was. But if these young people are not getting any of this messaging, and so I do see a generational divide in these forms. I don't mean at this moment, I'm saying just in like even conferences. I'm like, everybody here's 40. What happened to that 18-year-old? Because how they're experiencing their new founding of Blackness, they have to have that space. And every time I go to a funder, they're like, you don't need a podcast, like join an organization. I'm like, dude, I do that. Can we have one thing for us? Like, can we have, again, a podcast, a show, a movie that we create? Can we break, and especially in the Hollywood elite around, because they're the ones that will control anything we got in terms of that. And that's just coming from kind of learning these last couple of years, but I am still kind of flabbergasted that we're doing this amazing work, but it's not reaching, I think, as many younger people. I don't see that.
I'll just add briefly. I think in the legal space, it can, when you're reading about these Supreme Court cases and what's going on politically, it can be very disheartening. I think that what gives me hope for the future is that the generation of lawyers and movement lawyers who want to use the law as a tool for societal change are not ceding any ground when it comes to talking about race and racism in our law. We have a court system right now that wants to erase discussions of the law from the way that we litigate. And so we see that we've been here before, right? And so folks are getting more creative, are building more coalition, more unity in terms of we cannot go back to how we were before. And so what does that mean? That means that we have to push forward together, and that's creating opportunities for all of us, like Dr. Moreno Vega said, to create space for the individual experiences that are different. But the unifying root of it is that we are challenging a capitalist, racist, imperialist system that wants to commodify our lives and not allow us to have the dignity to define ourselves and to have the lives that we deserve.
Can I add one quick thing just to Rosa mention something, Regina, real quick? I think that Rosa, I think you're right. I think though there are some podcasts. I think we just need your organization to help promote them sometimes, because I think that's what happens. There are some people who don't get promoted. So for example, the brother who's doing Ritmos Negros podcast. There's Chombita Chronicles. There's Radio Caña Negra. There's Majestra Prieta. There's a bunch, but you know what it is? It's because they're not getting the media push. Then they're not getting supported. Then people don't know about them. But sometimes when I've interacted with them, they're doing really great work. But you're right, Rosa, people are not knowing about them. So then it's still niche knowledge, right? Of like only a few people know about them. But when I've interacted with like all those like Jovi Daniels from Chombita or some of the people, I'm like, yo, y'all are doing really great work. How can I uplift that work? Because I think what we need to do, that's what I say about organizing, right? There are some stuff happening, and they're happening kind of like in little silos. But if we support Ritmos Negros and Latinegras podcast and all of these things that are happening, then we start to be like, oh shoot, there's more. And that's where maybe that's where like y'all come in, right? People who have big platforms. And it's like, let's uplift these people. And let me show you that like Majestra Prieta is a podcast that's been doing that. So I know we got to have questions, but I just want to say that I just want to shout out, because I know some of them are tuning in right now. Because I was like, for Ascendis, and they're dope and they do really dope work. But you're right, we're not talking about them enough. And you're right, Rosa, the conversation stays within like a few, heads in certain spaces, and we got to lift up all these spaces that are doing that.
And that's why I call it Black Latinx Media Collective. I fought with even using the Latinx thing, but I know what was going on. I know how Hollywood and, generally how not just Hollywood, but other media makers. I saw a question here though, Olga, is that
yeah. We're gonna sorry.
No, go ahead.
Because I was gonna say
real quick. Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna definitely get to the questions that I want us to at least to get to two. But I know we've had such a rich conversation. There was one that really, really jumped out. Well, there's many that jumped out, but to transition to the questions, and maybe everyone or one or two can answer this, but how can we bridge the gap between Afro-Latinos of different national identities and promote unity?
The Afro-Panamanian question, where it says I'm an Afro-Panamanian who have had to deal with African Americans, that question?
Oh, so that's the one actually underneath it. This one was more about bridging the gap within Afro-Latinos of different national identities.
This is part of the objective, right? And mission of this series. Exactly. As of now, we have programmed 7 states, and I think it's 15 panels. And all of those panels have different people on them, local and national representatives, right? And identifying with groups that have done this work. which goes back to what Jose said. Things exist, but we don't know they exist, right? And this process is about uniting the organizations, the resources that exist, right? And I think that it's an intentional attempt to do that. And we need to again stop talking like we're not doing certain stuff. We have to say, this is a beginning process of doing that. And we need to support that process. We're putting together a reference so that articles that we've been coming across, we're including them there. A podcast, we can include them there, as references. We have to do the work. But we also have to be very positive in saying we need to support what is happening because it is happening. Right? But if we keep that mentality that it's not happening, then it won't happen. Right? So I've always thought going forward that magic can happen and we can make magic happen, and we have, and we will continue to do so. And it's all of our responsibility to do so.
I know Rosa wants to talk about the next question, but real quick on this one.
I'm good.
No, I know, but the next one you want to do, but on this one, real quick, I think that we have to recognize national differences. Like, look, the term Latino is a pan-ethnic term that includes pan-nationalities that is not going to be able to speak the reality of every single Latino person in this country. It's made really to use in this country, right? That's why sometimes we at the forum call it Afro-Latinidades or Latinidades, right? It's more than one and more than that. And what we need to do is recognize individual, like the unique particularities of being Afro-Colombian, being Garifuna, being non-Garifuna Afro-Honduran, being all of these particularities, and then recognize that. That's why I love that the name of the series is Absolutely Black, Absolutamente Negra, Negro, Negre, right? Because then that is to go to the theme that we've been saying, that is our unifying theme, is our experience as people of African descent. Because, to quote Dr. Nancy Lopez and all the researchers that do work, right? Our street race, when we go down the street, ain't no one questioning that we're Black. Or people can question other things, but there's one way we're treated. We're treated as Black people, and that's why uniting around that. So I think that's one way to do that. We have to understand national differences, and sure, the way that Afro-Colombians talk about certain issues is different than Afro-Puerto Ricans, is different than Garifunas, is different than Afro-Dominicans, is different than Afro-Panamanians, very different. Understand that, but then not, and then also really have that cultural humility to not be like everyone experiences the thing that I experienced. Like the way that sometimes we talk about certain things in the Afro-Colombian community here in the States is very different than other conversations that I have with other partners from different parts. And I think recognizing that helps that and bridges that, and not try to have one normative Black Latino experience. Like all of us are like this. No, because the reality is we're not. That's why there's all the media things that all the things that we need to do. Like Rosa said, we need to have more media, need to show diversity of Black Latinidad and diversity of Black of Black Latin American understanding, and not just have one normative way of understanding.
Absolutely. And as they say, Blackness is not a monolith. We constantly hear this all the time, but it extends beyond just maybe the African American lens, which I feel like is often used for, and really goes to all, Blackness all over. The next question, I think, Rosa, you were getting at this one, and hopefully we can get two more questions.
Very quick on that. It's the Afro-Panamanian, right? To deal with Americans for the U.S. So,
and for those who may not have gotten the whole question, the question is, I am Afro-Panamanian and have had to deal with African Americans from the U.S. erasing and not accepting my Blackness. How do we deal with that intentional erasure of our Blackness?
Yes, I think we can deal with it, but I'm also very when folks say that Dominicans are anti-Black, Panamanians are anti-Black, it's when they get to this country, why would they want to be Black? If they could pick every category from Black that erases Black, because we see how particularly African Americans and Puerto Rican as citizens have been treated. So if you're coming from a place like the DR, where if you were even fighting for Black Dominicans or the rights against Trujillo, you could be rounded up and killed, right? That's why I always say, if someone immigrates to this country and never have to call themselves Black, I understand why you wouldn't call yourself Black. Now, and to me, because that's, I think, a question we always get a lot, or it becomes very normalized to always say like a certain group is anti-Black, but not understand historically why they may be anti-Black.
And just to kind of add into that.
Sorry, there's also the reality of miseducation. You know, let's be very clear. The miseducation is part of the process of erasing people. Most of us grew up, right? At least my generation. And I have taught at the high school level, at the university level. Most people don't know even history of other countries, don't even know that they exist because they're never brought up. They're never brought up. When did we learn? When did any of you learn in the schools of the United States about Garifunas? When do you discuss Santo Domingo and the reality of Santo Domingo and Haiti? Right? So let's not make assumptions that we have information that most of us found on our own and with the work that we're doing. Right? We have to create that space where we understand what, Josue was talking about, the humongousness, if that's a word, of our experience, of our global experience. We have to understand it, and we have to claim it, and we have to talk about it, because most of us had to learn it on our own. We had to learn it on our own. When did we know that the largest population of African people, our people, were taken to Latin America and the Caribbean, Spanish-speaking Caribbean? Most of our kids don't know it. Most of us didn't know it. Most of us still don't know it. That the largest population of Africans were enslaved and brought to Latin America and the Caribbean. Brazil alone, 6 million.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the numbers that we have are humongous. People keep giving the wrong numbers. There's about 250 million African descendants in Latin America and the Caribbean together. That's a huge number. And what's happening right now is that they're coming to freedom. Right? Because of the conditions that exist, as I said before, in many of our countries, because of the policies of the United States that have destabilized a lot of our governments. So if we're going to speak, let's not speak ourselves about mythology. Let's break it down so that we understand it and can pass it on to others. Right? Because how many people talk about the numbers of Africans taken into the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese colonies? If you look at numbers, about 500,000 were brought to the United States. And about 50 million were taken to our countries. So that when we start looking at the numbers that are coming in, looking for freedom from various countries for the various reasons of political exile, for looking for freedom, looking for better possibilities, we also have to look at the conditions that were created and who created those conditions for people to come. But as Josue said before, we also have to look at the differences that we bring and the experiences we bring from the countries that we are leaving, looking for a better possibility. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take that much time.
No need to apologize. I think we can hopefully take one more question and then we'll be closing out. But there is a question here about, is there talk of creating an Afro-Latino museum or a major Afro-Latino space that will bring together in one central place information about our Afro-Latinx people?
Hell yeah, definitely. Definitely. I feel like all of us in one way, are working towards that. And there's some dope Afro Latino brothers and sisters in DC right now. Yeah, absolutely. Because we shouldn't even be having a conversation with the Latino Museum. Like, y'all know we're here. You're smart. You're lawyers. You purposely chose to erase us. Punto. They purposely are choosing to erase us. So we do have to start that. I totally believe that.
I'll also jump in and say that I think there definitely, like has been brought up in this conversation, the definition of space, right? Because I do think that when you look at, the Creative Justice Initiative, Corredor Afro, when you look at Afro-Latino Forum, when you look at the Garifuna Museum in Los Angeles, even though it's not all in one location, as we were saying, we're not a monolith. And so you're finding rich resources and access in these spaces to where it's dedicated to, our history, our culture. And even online, right? Again, the definition of space. So though for sure a central location, but there is definitely spaces all over that we can find ourselves in and see ourselves reflected.
And right now there's two exhibits, just to shout that out, like you said, in LA right now there's two exhibits right now. There's one in LMU, and there's one in LSU. LMU, and then there's one in the CSUSB. Afrontalo is an exhibit that's happening right now, and then there's a short exhibit called Afro-Latinos in Los Angeles happening also right now in those spaces. There's
how younger African Americans and Mexicanos are choosing their word, Black skin. Like, and because Kobe Bryant's daughters, people wouldn't realize, but Kobe Bryant, he raised them to understand they were Black skin. Like, what an incredible term, that those young people dealing with what's going on in California. Loyola Marymount, I went there to my
LMU, right? LMU,
the Bad Bunny class that she teaches, and I went and I met with a lot of those students who were like super clear they were African, Black. It was beautiful, So LMU, yeah.
Yeah, and then and to shout out another place where right now you can go see some Afro-Latino art is Spelman. Spelman and HBCU right now is featuring an exhibit by Armonia Rosales, Afro-Cuban artist from Chicago, lives in LA. So there's a lot of really great, like there are spaces. So you're right. The question and thing is like, is there a talk about creating? I think we need to start having it. I would say that La Doctora here has led many spaces in the way that she was, one of the first executive directors of El Museo del Barrio, with CCCADI, with all of that work. So there needs to do that. But there's all these other spaces where we're in. And again, I think it's about uplifting those, right? Like if you're in Atlanta, go to the Spelman exhibit by Armonia Rosales and see that art. If you're in LA, go to LMU or go to CSUSB and see their exhibits that they're doing. And then
in St. Croix, we have an exhibition, Absolutamente Negro, in St. Croix.
Right. So in the Bronx Museum, there's a lot of dope thing right now about Latinos in hip hop. In the Bronx Museum, shout out to the Bronx. I'm from Brooklyn, we spread love. But I got to shout out the Bronx, and so the Bronx has that. And you know what? They have a really interesting part of Panamanians in hip hop, Puerto Ricans in hip hop. And so it's good to shout that out because all of those, there might not be right now an Afro-Latino museum, but there are spaces. And I think like what Rosa's pointing to, what you were pointing to, Janelle, that there are spaces where that is. Maybe at some point we need to bring together and start getting all of these resources together because like Rosa said, with that name we didn't like the name, like the American Latino. No one refers to anyone as an American Latino. That's a weird name. So I was already like, bump that name, like whatever. Like that's not even our communities. But there are spaces that you can go to right now and to really like uplift Blackness in Latinidad.
And read books. We need people to read books. Like Dr. Vega has like 3 to 4. The ones behind me, like we need to get back. Even if I was thinking, do we do that again like we did as younger people, where you would read the book and then kind of come together? And that refers to Janelle saying, what does we look as space? It doesn't mean you have to physically go somewhere, but you know, you're not going to get this on TikTok in that way. So I'm always pushing younger people, like, read, because one book can change your life. Just like one moment can change your life. That's why books are so incredibly important.
Absolutely. And I honestly wish we can go on and on with this conversation, just because it's been so rich. We've touched on so many different topics, but the beauty of this is this conversation series goes on, and it's not just ending this evening. And so just want to remind everybody, please register at absolutamentenegro.org to receive updates about the conversation series over the course of the next year. There is a phase 1 of the conversation series, and it already has 7 confirmed cities and 11 events scheduled across the US, as well as expecting to add another 4 or 5 cities to phase 2. And so you can see all of those coming through your screen right now. But of course, again, you'll see them at absolutamentenegro.org. I want to thank everyone for being with us at this evening's event. I want to thank the Creative Justice Initiative, the Afro-Latino Forum, to each of our panelists, Dr. Marta, Josue, Rafaela, Rosa, for your insights. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening. And I'm sure we will see you at one, if not all, of the upcoming dates within the series. So again, much gratitude, and have a beautiful evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peace on.